Good morning, hello, good afternoon, good evening, from wherever you are joining us, our dear audience, in this third and last day from the special edition of No Talks, live from the London Book Fair 2022. Here we are in our last session with Shazia Ginai. And before we start our session, allow me, Shazia, to begin with some housekeeping. So the session will be held fully in English. However, interpretation into Arabic is available and can be accessed through the button on the bottom of your screen if you are joining us online. So all you need to do is click on the globe, on the interpretation globe, and choose Arabic. Also, please do drop your questions in the Q&A box all along the session, and I'll be happy to ask them. So thank you for being here with us, Shazia. Shazia Ginai, you are currently the CEO of Neuro-Insight UK, and you have a big background in marketing and in leadership positions. And you are also part of the Women in Research initiative, if I may call it. So I can't wait to hear from you, and welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my journey and about women in research, turning insight into action. So I'm Shazia Ginai. I'm the CEO of Neuro-Insight, which is a neuroscience-based research agency. We're based in London. And I'm going to tell you a bit about kind of the career path I've taken, which, as most researchers will tell you, was somewhat accidental. Any researcher I ask, you know, how did you get into this field? They always say, I sort of fell into it by accident. So I'm going to tell you about my series of accidents that brought me into this amazing career path. So I'll start just by sort of talking about what research is. So the type of research that I do is market and consumer research, and that's basically being curious, asking questions, trying to understand how people think and feel about all the products that they use in their lives. And we're all consumers, right? So it was a no-brainer for me to understand that, but also so mind-opening to kind of get to grips with what other people thought or felt. But obviously, as I said, I didn't fall into this intentionally. So we're trying now to encourage people to come into the sector more intentionally. And I know that many people who will listen to this, hopefully, will be like me, women, but also maybe women of color. And I have to say that growing up as a woman of color, there were certain things that my family had expected me to do. So I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or an engineer or a pharmacist. And I think this applies not just to women, but also to men. In our cultures, for those who emigrate over to Western countries, there is a desire for their children to be in secure jobs that give you sort of a defined space. And I, like my siblings, were also sort of encouraged to go down this path. For me, it was pharmacy. However, I was actually no good at all that stuff. And so I did pharmaceutical and cosmetic science at university, which is kind of like the malnourished sibling of a pharmacy degree. And my degree was at De Montfort. I got a place through clearing because, you know, like anyone who's had a reasonably successful career, I didn't do that well at school. And so during my degree, I had an internship. So my degree was 3 years long with the option to do an internship. And I did, because somebody very wisely told me that you can't get a career or a job without experience, and you can't get experience without a job. So I thought, do you know what? I'll give this a go and see what happens. So I went and did my internship, and I got one at Procter & Gamble. So a lot of people will know P&G. It's a big FMCG business. It's makes all of the stuff in our houses. And when I got my job, my internship at P&G, I was a scientist in the R&D labs finding a dimethicone replacement in liquid makeup. So I was working on foundation, and I was in a lab in my lab coat and my safety goggles, kind of all on my own, right? And people who know me know that that's not really my style. So I did that and it was fine. You know, I kind of enjoyed it, but I'm a real people person. I'm really curious, not just about what goes in the products that we use, but also the people who are using them, what they think and feel. So I then actually got moved. The powers that be shut my project down and I got moved onto a research project on the Hugo Boss skincare brand. So this was a brand new initiative. And so my job then became to understand how men felt about their grooming habits, which is a fascinating space. And this is going back about 20 years. So it was a long time ago. And it was when men didn't really openly talk about their thoughts and feelings when it came to their beauty routines. So I really had to dig deep. And when I finished my internship and I was researching these people, I stood up and did a presentation. And during that presentation, the first half was about my cosmetics in the lab project. And the second half was about the research project I did on skincare. And somebody said to me, you were like two different people. You know, you have the kind of nature where you're meant to work in research. And so there were a few lessons I learned from that part of my career journey. One was to really know myself, to really dig into who I was. And the truth was I was a really curious person who loved to understand how people thought and felt about things. And then to trust myself and really move forward. And, you know, if the lab job doesn't feel right, go after what you want and really believe that you can do it, believe in yourself. So I then finished my degree against all odds. And then I went back to P&G. They'd offered me a job. So I went back to the world of men's skincare and I learned every kind of research under the sun. And I think people don't always realize that the world of market research is so broad. You know, you learn qualitative research, so really getting under the skin of how people articulate their thoughts and feelings, quantitative research, where you're digging into data and numbers, biometric research, which is sort of the area I'm in now, behavioral research, translation, that's one part of it, recruitment, there's all sorts of arms, it's so vast. I mean, when I was working on the skincare range for men, I went and lived in a castle for 2 days with 8 guys and learned about their beauty routines, which was quite an immersive experience. Now, after I'd done that, I then moved on to what's called Frontend Innovation. So I was still at Procter & Gamble, wonderful company. And I moved into this world of front-end innovation. And this took my research and curiosity even further. It became about understanding the things that people didn't even know they wanted. So initially it was about what's the consumer need and how do I design products that kind of get there. Then it became about understanding the things people didn't even know they wanted. So a really open experience for me, but still within the confines of R&D. So I was in a research role, but in a certain space. I then moved on to perfume. Now, perfume, luckily, I worked on Hugo Boss again. So I worked on lots of different ones. The last one being my absolute favorite, which was Boss Bottled Night. There was a cardboard cutout of Ryan Reynolds by my desk, which made going to work really enjoyable every day. But one of the things that I learned when I moved into this space was that when you're working on a product that is solely emotional, which the perfume category really is, then your job changes. It becomes a lot more commercially focused, right? Because there's less product-y stuff in there. So it was a really enjoyable moment for me because I got to expand even further. And I had a love for storytelling. So I've always been a real bookworm and I love stories. And again, when I learned to reflect on who I was and understood who I was underneath it all, I took some of that into the job. So I was lucky enough to work on a storytelling process. So this all went back to Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, and that was used as the backbone for this storytelling process that was already being used at P&G, but I tweaked it and turned it into more of an emotional storytelling process. And off the back of that, I got to work on multiple brands. And some of them were really interesting because, for example, I ran a workshop on always sanitary towels. And when I was working on always sanitary towels, one of the things that became so apparent was the language being used to talk about the products was heavily driven by men, and yet men don't get periods. So there were a room full of these tech guys in the workshop talking about the product and how it worked, and they were using this very male language. And again, it drove home the point around needing female voices in the room, because so many products are used by women, so they should be created by women. So it was a really interesting part doing the story piece. And there were things I learned here as well. Keep on learning, be open to new opportunities. You know, I tried lots of different things, and it expanded how I felt about research. It kind of changed the way I thought. I feel like I grew a lot and I changed. Be brave. It's terrifying, but it's so worth it. And trust your instinct. I think once we know ourselves quite well, then it's safe to say that when your gut is telling you something, then that's being authentic to who you are. And you should trust your instinct, especially when your instinct is telling you that it's time to move on. So there was a moment when I decided it was time to move on. So in 2012, there were two big things that happened for Procter & Gamble. One was they sponsored the Olympics. So it was amazing. The Olympic torch came through the site that I was working at. It was fantastic. But also they went through a huge redundancy program. And one of the things that they said was, because they were making so many cuts, they said the first round will be anyone who wants to volunteer, you can go. And so a bunch of people applied for voluntary redundancy, because why wouldn't you? If you're ready to leave and someone's going to pay you to leave, then it's not a bad situation to be in. The interesting thing, though, was, as I said earlier, being brave is important. It felt like a lot of people who I'd worked with felt very safe, and it's a really nurturing environment. And so leaving felt very unsafe. So I took this step. I decided to go. I did a lot more work on knowing myself. And then this happened. So I don't know if anyone watches the TV show Friends, but there's an amazing episode when Chandler leaves his job and he is looking for another job, and he takes a bunch of aptitude tests. And it turns out that what he's meant to be doing was what he'd been doing all along. And I always relate to that, because I went through this. I was 29 when I left that job, almost 30. And I was like, right, it's time to think about doing something else. And it turned out that I had known myself, and what I was doing was what I was meant to be doing. I was always meant to understand people, just in a different way. So from there, I went on to GHD. Now, the hairstyling company. Everyone looks at this brand and thinks amazing, premium hairstyling brand. The C-suite level when I joined was all men, and it is a female product predominantly. It's not entirely, but there were no women at the table making the decisions. And anyone I speak to says, how can that be? And I'm like, well, because at the top, that's usually the way it is. So again, it was another example where some of the major decision-making that was going on was happening by a room full of men on a product that was majority used by women. That was an incredibly tough environment to work in as well. The company went through enormous growth. And while I worked there for 4 years, I had 7 bosses in total. There was a lot of flux, a lot of change. And I would say that that moment in time was the hardest, best and worst career decision of my life to that point. And it was interesting because I learned the most and grew the most during that time. And when it came to my understanding of commercial research and really impacting business results, this is where I had a very steep learning curve, but an incredibly valuable one. The other thing that I learned here was to know when there's no more unfinished business. So about 1.5 to 2 years in, I really wanted to leave because I was surrounded by people who were quite toxic. However, I felt my instinct was telling me I had unfinished business. And so I stayed But after 4 years, I felt really content and peaceful and ready to move on. And when that happens, you then take some time to heal. I got another job, and then I took 6 weeks off between the two jobs to take time to heal. And that year, Ramadan, which is currently happening, was over that period. So I spent the time for the first time in years not working, being at home, and really taking the time to reflect. I also went on a 2-week holiday to Australia, which was lovely. But another interesting thing happened when it comes to being a woman in research was that the job I took was at this company called Neuro-Insight, but I had 2 opportunities that I had been presented with. One was for a qualitative research agency, and one was for Neuro-Insight, which is out of this world, measuring people's brains, completely different space. I never, ever thought I would go to an agency. I always said I'd work for a brand, but again, being open to trying new things, that played a part in my decision-making. And when I was looking at these 2 jobs, the job at Neuro-Insight was a business development job. It was a big old sales and marketing job, something I was quite nervous about doing. But I decided to give that a go. The other job on the table was a qualitative job. And the people who owned the company, they actually said to me, "We're looking for a woman to be on our board. We hope you don't mind that we do make some sexist jokes sometimes." And I thought, so you're actively telling me that you're looking for a woman as a token, and you will not stop your misogynistic behavior. Then I thought I would rather be on a different board. And I walked away from it and pursued the Neuro Job. And I think that it is so vital that we find our space as women in leadership and in research as well. But it's also really important to take the right roles, because there'll be a lot that isn't right for us as well. So I moved to this amazing company where we measure electrical brain activity with this amazing technology called steady state topography. It's a magical place. The guy who founded the tech, he's a neuroscientist, a professor in Australia. In fact, currently he's working on studying telepathy between twins, which is, don't ask me anything about it because I couldn't tell you anything about it. But the job really brought together the love of a few things for me. So one being my storytelling. So our brain actually constructs our world through stories. That's how we make sense of the world. It's how we make meaning of life. And so it was going back to that love I had for storytelling. The other thing is that our brains seek human connection and relevance. And again, this was a magical moment for me, someone who is curious about human connection, understanding people. And then also knowing that our memories are colored by emotions. So bringing together my love for the thinking and the feeling, the quantitative and the qualitative. So I worked at Neuro-Insight for a couple of years, and then ironically, actually, and I only realized this today when I was getting off the train coming here, on March the 6th in 2019, I was in this space, in this room in Kensington Olympia, where the CEO at the time told me she was resigning and handing the company over to me. So I was actually here when I found out. I was at a trade show, and which is somewhat a bizarre time to tell someone that they're taking such a lofty position. But yeah, my life completely changed. So the articles were published, it went out in the trade press, and suddenly everything changed. I was learning how to do this huge job, and I felt like a massive imposter, like we all do all the time. And I was taking on this role as being a female CEO, but also a woman of color, which I think, you know, when I walk into a room of my peers, there's hardly anyone who looks like me. So it was quite a terrifying moment. And I questioned a lot whether or not I actually belong there. During the month when I found out, something else was going on as well. So I was part of a campaign called Beyond the Invisible, which was shot by Rankin, a world famous photographer. And it was for the charity Endometriosis UK. So I was diagnosed with endometriosis when I was 25 years old. I had a surgery when I was 26, and I had another surgery when I was 35. And this campaign came out to help drive awareness around invisible illnesses. And in the same month that I was promoted to CEO, my face was plastered all over a gallery in London and then in Scotland. And I was talking about living with this illness and with chronic pain. And I remember the day I found out I was becoming a CEO, I thought, I wish I'd been born a man, which is the worst thing a woman can think. And it's because I often felt like having a condition like this would mean it would hold me back. And there would be more surgeries coming, and I would really struggle with that. But instead, I decided to talk about it, and I spread the word around it because actually I'm really proud of being a woman. And so talking about something like this became a part of my narrative as a leader and woman in research. So in addition to that, I decided that given that when you get into leadership, people listen to you. Finally, you're not just screaming into a void. So I decided to get involved in other initiatives. So one of them is the Market Research Society's Diversity Inclusion Council. So I joined that and participated in driving awareness around gender equality in the market research sector, and also racial justice, anything around sexual orientation, disability, and also I'm championing menstrual health a lot. And then in 2021, the Women in Research exec program, which I've been part of, we co-founded Wire Accelerate, which is a professional development program for women in research, because we know that there are a lot of women out there who don't have access to really important information required to progress in your career, such as understanding and quantifying your ROI, understanding finance and investments, networking, which seems to be a dirty word for so many people, but it's actually really valuable. And then I was awarded Insight 250 winner last year as well, which was a real privilege. So the last thing I'm just going to end on is to touch on why we need diverse voices. So I've kind of talked a little bit about this as we've gone through. I mean, I believe, and the neuroscience that I live by now also proves that we create a world based on the context within which we exist. And the world is really vast. And we need those different lived experiences to represent the people that we are making products for, that we are servicing, that we are building our lives around. And so it's super important for those diverse voices to be heard. When you look at the boardroom and majority of the people sitting there are male and half the population of the planet is female, it feels that we aren't necessarily perhaps speaking the language of the audience that we're serving. So it feels pretty straightforward to me. You know, we need it, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it makes perfect business sense. So that's my main reason. So that's it for me. Thank you for listening to my story. It's been really cathartic putting it together, actually, kind of just revisiting all those years. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Shazia. I'm in awe. It's really inspiring.
Thank you.
And I hope that you get really good news today again from here.
Fingers crossed.
Ramadan Kareem, by the way.
Yeah, thank you.
I have many questions for you.
Okay, go for it.
I really loved your story. Really, thank you for sharing it. It's really inspiring, and people love stories.
Yeah.
I personally really resonated and identified in many parts of your story. First of all, how you were saying that you are in research by accident.
Yep.
I really resonated with that. And the thing that you are from the global South and a woman of color and a woman, all of this. So thank you, really. So my first question I would like to ask you, you touched upon some of the challenges you have had along the way, but Can you tell me a bit more? Were there stereotypes in the big companies that you have worked in?
Yeah, I mean, I think P&G was definitely the best of the bunch because it's a huge organization. And so they worked on their inclusion from quite early on. But there's definitely still sort of microaggressions everywhere I went. One of the things that was really interesting for me was I shortened my name for the first 7 years of my career. So my name's Shazia, and whenever I introduced myself as Shazia, people struggled with my name. So I shortened it to Shaz for about 7 years. And when I left that job, I promised myself I would not do that again. Because people, if you can learn to say entrepreneur, you can learn to say Shazia. It's as simple as that. So there were definitely those sorts of stereotypes that were in existence. I think the other thing was wherever I went, even in a work context, people would ask whether I was married or whether I wanted to have children. And I really honestly don't believe that should impact your choices in your career. So as women, when we're thinking about whether or not we want to have kids, I know women who turn down promotions because they believe that will hold them back. And I don't think you should. You know, we are biologically, we have to have the babies, but that should not be a reason why we stop. I think when I was at GHD, that was probably the place where there were the most, I guess, there was a bit more misogyny. It was a bit more toxic. And that was because it trickles from the top down. It's about business culture. So it was owned by a private equity firm and it was sold to trade while I worked there. And that's quite a transition that you go through. PE businesses, you know, they're super fast paced and they don't necessarily build their culture around people related values. And I think that inherently drives some of those awful stereotypes that we see. So yeah, I definitely saw more of it there. And now I get to build my own culture. So fingers crossed I will be better than they ever were. Or I hope I already am.
Surely are. And I'm glad that you now call yourself Shazia and not Shaz.
Yeah.
And I certainly have more trouble saying entrepreneur than Shazia.
Yeah.
So and like by calling yourself like your real name, by saying who you are, by being genuine, without knowing, you are representing many people and people can identify with you.
Yeah, I think
that's really important.
It was one of the talks actually as part of the Wire Accelerate program. It was you can't be who you can't see. And so we made sure that we were talking about women in research and women in leadership so that other young women could see that and know that they have a chance of being that. You know, the role models that exist are often kind of pigeonholed in one space and they tend not to be attainable at all, and therefore people don't aspire to it because they just don't think they can get there. Not many people would say I can be Elon Musk, you know, and they seem to be the stereotypes of what success looks like, whereas there are plenty of women now who are trying to build that, and we need more to come forward and help to drive that.
Definitely. Women in science now and women in research, they are really underrepresented. Yes. I think the ratio is 1/3 women to 2/3 men. And I think maybe it is even less than this. And of course, in leading positions, it is like way less.
Yeah.
So why do you think there are fewer women than men in research?
Good question. So in market research, there's actually quite a lot of women at the bottom. So there's a lot of research that's been done around it. I think you tend to get less at the top because they give up their careers to be primary caregivers for their children, which again, you know, we should be trying to build a culture of co-parenting and shared parenting. And then also there's just inherent bias that stops them from getting up to the top. When it comes to science, there's a much bigger gap. And the reason for that is just the encouragement from a young age. So there is less encouragement for women to go into those fields. The other thing is in 2019, the Advertising Standards Authority brought in some new regulation around stereotyping in advertising. And I remember talking to somebody who said to me that, don't you think that's a bit overkill? Like, aren't we going a bit far? And I said, well, no, because your 2-year-old child will be playing with their toys while the television is on in the background. And even though they're not watching TV, if that TV is on loud and there is a man putting on a suit and going to work and a woman cleaning the house in an advert, what that does is it builds a narrative inside that child's mind. There is so much going in our brains implicitly, and we have to start representing right from the get-go in every context that we see, like gendered roles kind of not even reversed, just removed. We shouldn't be so binary about these things. And if we can change that, then we can rewire how we see the world, because a lot of the issues around this, they are hardwired, generations long, conditioned stereotypes. And it takes a hell of a lot of work to undo that. We published at Neuro-Insight a paper a couple of years ago called Beyond Binary. It's about how brands can navigate the non-binary gender landscape. And as part of that, we investigated how the brain, the subconscious brain, so not our conscious minds, but our subconscious, how it processes gender roles in advertising. And there was an unbelievable amount of insight that came out about how we are so hardwired with some of this stuff. Yeah.
It's so true.
Yeah.
And like the stereotype is real. Like whenever we hear the word lawyer, we think about a man, and nurse, woman, like, no, it shouldn't be like this.
Exactly.
And I think it starts from, like, as you said, this needs like a really big shift, a cultural shift. Like if you don't know from where to start, like it needs to start with the upbringing, with home,
Absolutely.
with early childhood education, with education all along the way. Because I don't think the problem is only like there are like women in research are not encouraged, but of course there are not enough women in research. There are not enough graduates from such from such subjects. And I want to ask you, do you think, like, how can women achieve gender parity?
Oh, of course, it's a big question, isn't it? I mean, I think we need to, you know, women aren't the only ones who have the work to do here. You know, we can keep fighting, but we need the men to do the work too. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that we face. You know, men have a role to play in enabling women. So when it comes to a woman's right to work or a woman's ability to go to work after having her kids, I have a few friends who've shared their maternity and paternity with their partners. I know some businesses that allow the same amount of paternity leave as maternity leave. And it's, women have some work to do in, you know, pushing forward and pushing through the stereotypes, and not always saying, okay, this is the way we're meant to do it, therefore that's how we'll do it. But men have a lot of work to do as well. They have the largest share of voice. And so we need their alliance. We need them to be partners through this. It's a big old question. You know, I think there's a few areas where there's some very tangible actions. So one is that women tend to shy away from things. We will, and we need to not. That's what we need to do. We need to push forward for the big jobs. We need to not think that we aren't capable, because a lot of the time a man will pursue something that he's like, oh, I'm not sure I'll get that, but I'll try anyway. Whereas a woman will go, oh, I'm not sure I'll get that, so I'm just going to back off. And it's conditioned in us as a response. You know, women are taught from very early on, and culturally there are some real differences too. So women from certain cultures will have an even bigger kind of level of oppression in their culture that will result in this. So definitely South Asian, Middle Eastern cultures, there's a lot less space for women to do that. And it's the men who need to work with us to change that.
I totally agree. But do you think there are enough women empowering other women? Or do you think that whenever they get to certain positions, they tend to forget where they came from?
I think that quite a lot of, I know that when I got this role, the best thing I did was I found my tribe. So I found a group of women who were my empowerers, and I did the same for them. And I think that that is super important. We are our best chance at getting equality, because men do need to do the work, but we should empower each other. I think we're getting better at it. I think there was a time when that was a lot harder, and it was because there was less space for us. And so women were fighting for a small piece of the pie. But I think now women are so much more understanding of the fact that there's room for all of us, you know, that will make room for all of us. So we're getting there. We're getting there.
Okay. We are starting to get questions from the audience.
Oh, okay.
So here's one. Are there still gender differences in research environments?
Oh, massively. Yes, 100%. So one of the things that, you know, we always talk about is the reason that you need is my GHD example. When all the people who are talking about something aren't the people who are using it, you're going to get a bias. And as they say, if you have a brain, you have a bias, right? So everyone has one. I do, you do, we all do. There are huge gender differences in the research world. And I think that, as I said, in a lot of market research, so when I go to any market research society events, there's a lot of females sort of at the entry level jobs, and all the senior leaders are men. And that's a huge issue. So there's massive gender differences in that space for sure.
As the CEO of Neuro-Insight UK, I can't but ask you about some of the recent findings that you have had at the company. For example, can you give us any insights of how perhaps our brains are changing, and maybe what was the effect of the pandemic on our brains? And
great question. I get asked this a lot.
Women's versus men's brain.
Yeah. So interestingly, people always ask me if there's difference between women's and men's brains. Now, here's the science part. Our brains are structurally and functionally the same, and they evolved to the point they're at now. The difference in terms of how our brains react and respond to things is driven by our life context. And so that's why between men and women, you do get very different responses to things. When we published a paper Beyond Binary, there was a really interesting finding. So there's a couple of years ago now, Gillette launched an advert about toxic masculinity. And when that ad was launched, we looked at the gender brain response for women and for men. There's a region of the brain that we measure, and the metric there we call engagement, but it's a sense of personal relevance and how you identify with something. And what we found was that during the ad, the mention of toxic masculinity and all the things around it, that men's brains were less active in that region, but women's brains were more active. And yet the ad is targeted at men. And the reason for that is because men are almost not realizing that the problem exists, and women are, because they're impacted by it. And so there are differences in how we respond to things because those things impact our lives. And there are reasons why men don't respond to them. And that's because they care a little bit less. They're not impacted by it. And that's what I mean by that hard wiring that needs to change, because that's ultimately going to shift how we tackle gender inequality. Yeah.
Awesome. I'd like to go back to, yes, of course. Yeah. Just a sec, I'll give you my mic.
I'm just wondering, so with regards to the differences in which, you have the men and the women in the way that we think, is there a way of women tackling inequalities within the realm within which we operate normally? So you know, what you were talking about earlier as well with regards to like women kind of tackling a problem, maybe they'd be like less likely to take the job because they didn't think they were up to the standards. And it's like the different way in which women are operating. So I'm really not asking this well, but basically what I'm trying to say is like can women still get equality keeping our sort of traits, like as in
yes,
like,
a great question.
Traits,
so I don't believe that to get ahead you have to channel masculine energy. I think that we need, and do you know, a couple of years ago I was talking to my PR team and I remember saying to them, it's called Mother Nature and not Father Nature for a reason. And my reasoning for that, and it turned into an article that was published in City AM, and the reason I'd said it was because women have inherent qualities, like we have higher levels of empathy, we have more nurturing qualities, and guess what? They're all qualities for leadership. But the world made us believe that male were meant to be leaders, as opposed to understanding the qualities for good leadership. And now what we're reading about, you know, for the first time in years, there used to be a time when it was, we don't sleep, we're really hardcore, we're kind of angry at the boardroom table. And now we're getting to a point where leadership is being talked about as being empathetic and more considerate and more people-centric. They're all female qualities. So I think we should be channeling more of that female quality. It's about the recognition and awareness. So our kind of conditioned response is to pull away. And it's almost owning it and empowering ourselves to kind of take what we are and push forward for that being valued and valuable. So you're absolutely right. I don't think that we should be being male to succeed. We should channel our female qualities, which are inherently leadership qualities.
Thank you. I have actually read this article and you say that compassion and empathy are, yes, are the two
100%
are super important for leadership.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I totally believe in this and I keep preaching about it. So we are talking about women in research and like we are focusing a bit on gender equality, but does it entail also somewhere like other aspects so we can leave no one behind, such as like the racial equality, religious equality?
Absolutely.
All of this, like having people from the north and the south, all of this, persons with disabilities.
Absolutely.
Also.
So when I joined the Market Research Society's Diversity and Inclusion Council, the first thing people were talking about was gender, then it was race, and now there are multiple groups set up. So the MRS has MRS Unlimited, which is around disability, both physical and neurodiverse. And then we have MRS Pride, which is on sexual orientation and also gender identity. We have Color of Research, which I'm now a board member of. And we also have, WIRE. So there's so many arms, but the point is always that we should be accepting and allowing space for people of all kinds of lived experiences and backgrounds to be able to say their piece, because the world is made up of diverse voices and faces, and we need to have those people getting the data, making the decisions, making the products, driving the services, whatever it might be. It's so important that everyone is represented. So 100%, I think when diversity and inclusion initiatives are set up, they should be tackling all elements of it. It's hard to do. And I remember when George Floyd was killed, that a lot of people, they decided, some businesses were saying, oh, we need to focus on race. And I'm like, you can't forget about everything else. You have to remember that there are multiple arms. You should be caring about race. You should be caring about gender. You should make your businesses more accessible for people with disability. And that's why you need those people at the table, because we humans tend to care most and think most about what is relatable to them in their life context. So if the boardroom is full of cisgendered, middle-aged white men, then ultimately that's the only thing that they're going to be considering when they're making their decisions.
Definitely. And this is the danger of a single-sided story. Like,
absolutely. It's so important we represent everyone.
yes. I cannot take any more questions. I'm sorry. So now we have reached our last segment, my favorite.
Oh, this is the quick fire.
Yes. The fire questions, this or that questions.
Go for it. Hit me with them.
Yes, they are easy ones.
Okay.
Sort of. Okay. Top-down or bottom-up approaches?
Oh, that is a tough one. I would say top down, but bottom up is also really important. You have to listen to your organization and have some humility and be on the ground sometimes. But top down, driving that culture from there.
True. Let's start with top down.
Okay.
Okay. So remote work or work from the office?
Oh, again, I feel like the answer to all of these questions is going to be something in the middle. Do you know my honest answer to this? Flexibility.
Yes.
I mean, I've been asked this so many times, and I've spoken to some business leaders who've said, oh, you know, we're making everyone come back. And I said, have you learned nothing? One size does not fit all. Let's be flexible.
True.
Yeah.
Non-binary.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry to be asking you to be a bit binary. Being born a man or a woman?
Oh, woman, 100%.
Yeah, you go, girl.
Yeah, we've got so many amazing traits.
We
so
do.
many.
We do. Compassion, empathy.
Oh, yeah.
To name a couple only.
I mean, a woman can make life and give birth. I mean, that's incredible.
It is.
Right? I have not done that, by the way. Any woman who has, I am in awe of her.
Yeah, me too.
It's also not all we are, just to be clear.
True. But I have no idea how they do it. Like,
yeah.
Super hard. Okay, the last one. Being a woman from the north or the south?
I would say from the south.
From the south.
And it's because I'm brown and I live in the UK. My context is so much broader.
Yes.
Because I have lived different cultures, and I think it makes me more well-rounded.
Okay. But
Yeah,
maybe a
it's
few years
painful too.
back,
oh yeah,
you would have said north. Yes.
Yeah, it's tough. It's
Yeah,
really hard.
It is. But you are inspiring. Thank you for being you. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And with you, we are ending our special edition of No Talks from the London Book Fair. I would like to thank our audience, all our speakers, Anthony also for moderating other sessions. And I'd like also to thank the interpreters and other colleagues. Also, if any of you would like any of the presentations or would like to connect maybe with any of the speakers, please do reach out and we will see what we can do. And let's keep sharing knowledge. Let's keep the conversation going. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.